A powerful corporate lawyer thought he was arguing against some nobody public defender. He mocked her credentials, questioned her intelligence, and dismissed her in front of the entire courtroom. He had no idea she was about to be nominated to the Supreme Court of the United States. Dr. Elaine Crawford stood in Manhattan Civil Court, representing an elderly immigrant woman pro bono. Across from her was Richard Dalton, one of New York's most expensive defense attorneys, representing a billion-dollar corporation. He saw a black woman in a modest suit and assumed she was out of her league. But what Dalton didn't know, what nobody in that courtroom knew, was that in exactly 4 hours the President of the United States would announce Elaine's nomination to the highest court in the land. And every condescending word Dalton spoke was about to become national news. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Courtroom 7 in the Manhattan Civil Court building, casting long rectangular shadows across the polished wooden floor. The room hummed with the quiet energy of a high-stakes case about to begin, lawyers shuffling papers, court reporters testing their equipment, and spectators filling the gallery with whispered speculation. Dr. Elaine Crawford sat at the plaintiff's table with a composure that came from 30 years of legal practice. At 52, she carried herself with quiet dignity, her natural hair styled in elegant locks that fell past her shoulders, her navy suit well-tailored but noticeably less expensive than those worn by the defense team across the aisle. But there was something about the way she held herself, a certain stillness, a confidence that didn't come from courtroom victories alone. It came from somewhere deeper. Beside her sat her client, Mrs. Linda Chen, a 73-year-old Chinese immigrant who'd worked as a seamstress for 40 years before the garment factory she'd devoted her life to had suddenly closed, denying her and 200 other workers their earned pensions. The corporation claimed bankruptcy, but Elaine had discovered something they'd hoped would stay hidden. The executives had funneled millions into offshore accounts weeks before the closure. Across the aisle sat the defense team. 3 attorneys in expensive suits, led by Richard Dalton of Whitmore and Associates, one of Manhattan's most prestigious corporate defense firms. Dalton was in his late 40s, with perfectly styled silver-streaked hair, a Rolex that caught the light when he gestured, and the kind of confidence that came from never losing a case to anyone he considered beneath him. He glanced at Elaine with barely concealed amusement, then leaned toward his associate and whispered something that made the younger lawyer smirk. Dalton had made a critical error in judgment, an error that would cost him everything. "All rise," the bailiff's voice echoed through the courtroom. "The Honorable Judge Patricia Morrison presiding." Judge Morrison entered, a woman in her early 60s with sharp eyes and a reputation for running an efficient courtroom. She took her seat, surveyed both legal teams, and opened the case file. "Chen versus Millbrook Manufacturing," she announced. "This is a class action suit regarding unpaid pension benefits. Ms. Crawford, you're representing the plaintiffs?" Elaine stood smoothly. "Yes, Your Honor. Dr. Elaine Crawford on behalf of Mrs. Linda Chen and 217 former employees of Millbrook Manufacturing." Dalton stood immediately. "Richard Dalton for the defense, Your Honor. And if I may, I'd like to request a brief sidebar before we begin." Judge Morrison raised an eyebrow. "We haven't even started, Mr. Dalton." "What's the issue?" Dalton's smile was patronizing. "Your Honor, with all due respect to Ms. Crawford's enthusiasm, this is an extremely complex corporate bankruptcy case involving intricate financial instruments and international asset transfers. I'm concerned that opposing counsel may not have the expertise to effectively represent her clients in such sophisticated litigation." You could feel the insult in the air, the assumption, the dismissal. It was the kind of microaggression that happened every day in courtrooms across America. The courtroom fell silent. Several people in the gallery shifted uncomfortably. Mrs. Chen looked at Elaine with concern, but Elaine's expression remained perfectly calm. "Mr. Dalton," Judge Morrison said carefully, "are you suggesting opposing counsel is not qualified to practice before this court?" "Not at all, Your Honor. I'm simply noting that this case requires a level of financial and corporate law expertise that typically comes from, well," he glanced at Elaine, "more prestigious institutions. I see from the court filings that Ms. Crawford teaches at a law school, which is admirable. But actual courtroom experience in high-level corporate matters is quite different from academic theory. Elaine stood slowly. Her voice when she spoke was measured, almost gentle. Your Honor, I appreciate Mr. Dalton's concern for my client's representation. To address his questions about my qualifications, I graduated from Harvard Law School, where I was president of the Law Review. I clerked for Justice Thurgood Marshall on the Supreme Court. I've taught corporate law, constitutional law, and civil procedure at Columbia Law School for the past 20 years. I've argued 12 cases before federal appellate courts and won 10 of them. And I've published over 40 articles in peer-reviewed law journals on precisely the kind of financial instruments Mr. Dalton finds so complex. The courtroom was absolutely silent now. Even Dalton's associate had stopped smirking. But that wasn't even the most impressive credential Elaine possessed, not even close. Elaine continued, her voice still calm but carrying unmistakable authority. However, if Mr. Dalton would like to request a competency hearing to determine whether I'm qualified to practice before this court, I'm happy to submit my full curriculum vitae, my academic publications, and testimony from the numerous federal judges I've appeared before. We can spend several days on that motion, or we can proceed with the case and let the quality of my legal arguments speak for themselves. Judge Morrison looked at Dalton with barely concealed irritation. Mr. Dalton, do you have a formal motion to make, or were you simply grandstanding? Dalton's face had reddened. No formal motion, Your Honor. I was merely, then let's proceed with opening statements. And Mr. Dalton? In my courtroom, we judge lawyers by the quality of their arguments, not by assumptions about their background. Ms. Crawford clearly has the credentials to be here. Do you? A few people in the gallery actually gasped. It was rare for a judge to dress down an attorney so publicly. Dalton sat down stiffly. Of course, Your Honor. Good. Ms. Crawford, your opening statement. Elaine walked to the jury box with measured steps. She didn't rush, didn't overcompensate. She simply moved with the confidence of someone who'd spent 3 decades mastering her craft. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, she began, her voice clear and strong, this case is about a simple promise. Work hard for 40 years and you'll have security in your retirement. That's the promise Millbrook Manufacturing made to Mrs. Chen and 217 other workers. People who came to this country seeking opportunity, who worked 10-hour days in difficult conditions, who paid into their pension fund every single paycheck for decades. She paused, making eye contact with each juror. The defense will try to convince you this is a complicated corporate bankruptcy. They'll use terms like restructuring and asset protection and fiduciary obligations. But underneath all that legal language is a simple truth. The executives at Millbrook Manufacturing took money that belonged to these workers and hid it where they thought no one would find it. And Elaine had found it. Every dollar, every hidden account, every fraudulent transfer. Over the next few days, I'm going to show you exactly where that money went. I'm going to show you the paper trail of wire transfers, the shell corporations in the Cayman Islands, the luxury purchases made by executives who claimed the company was broke. And then I'm going to ask you to do something very simple. Give these workers what they earned. She returned to her table. Mrs. Chen reached over and squeezed her hand gratefully. Dalton stood for his opening statement, and his strategy was immediately clear. Overwhelm the jury with complexity. Ladies and gentlemen, Ms. Crawford has painted a simple picture because that's all she understands. But corporate bankruptcy law is anything but simple. Millbrook Manufacturing didn't hide money. They engaged in standard corporate restructuring to protect assets from creditors, which is their legal right under Chapter 11 of the Bankruptcy Code. He went on for 20 minutes, citing statutes, using technical terms, and generally trying to confuse rather than clarify. Several jurors looked lost. When he finally sat down, Judge Morrison called for a lunch recess. But Elaine wasn't thinking about lunch. She was thinking about the phone call she'd received at 6 a.m. that morning, the one that had changed everything. The phone call had come at 6 a.m., 3 hours before Elaine needed to leave for court. She'd been reviewing her case notes, her 4th cup of coffee already empty, when her phone lit up with a Washington, D.C. area code. Dr. Crawford, this is Senator James Walsh. I'm sorry to call so early, but I need to inform you that the President will be announcing your nomination to the Supreme Court at 2 p.m. today. The moment that would change her life forever. But first, she had a case to win. Elaine had known the nomination was coming. She'd been vetted for months, had private meetings with the President, had prepared for the intense scrutiny. But the timing was unexpected. She had a case in court. Real people depending on her. Mrs. Chen, who'd saved every penny for 40 years only to have it stolen by corporate greed. "Senator," she'd said carefully, "I have a court appearance this morning. A class action case for pension theft. Can the announcement wait until—" "Dr. Crawford, the political timing is critical. We need to announce today. But—" Senator Walsh had paused. "The President specifically chose you because you haven't forgotten where you came from. Because even with all your accomplishments, you still take pro bono cases for people who can't afford fancy lawyers. He thinks that's exactly the kind of person who should be on the court." So Elaine had made a decision. She would finish this case, and then her life would never be the same. Now, during the lunch recess, Elaine sat in a small conference room reviewing documents with her young associate, Marcus Reed. Marcus was a recent law school graduate who jumped at the chance to work with the legendary Professor Crawford, even though it meant long hours and no pay on pro bono cases. "Professor," Marcus said, looking up from a spreadsheet, "I found something." 3 days before Millbrook declared bankruptcy, the CFO transferred $2.3 million to a company called Sunset Holdings, LLC. It's registered in Delaware, but the principal address it's the CFO's home address. Elaine leaned forward, studying the document. That's fraud. Clear, prosecutable fraud. Should we bring it up this afternoon? We should. But we need to be strategic. Dalton's going to try to bury us in technical jargon during witness examination. We need to cut through that and make it simple for the jury. But as Elaine prepared her strategy, she had no idea that across town, Richard Dalton was making a decision that would haunt him forever. In a different conference room 3 blocks away, Richard Dalton sat with his legal team and his client, the CEO of Millbrook Manufacturing. "This Crawford woman is more competent than I expected," Dalton admitted. Her opening was effective. Simple, emotional. The jury liked it. His associate, a young lawyer named Jason, pulled up something on his tablet. "I did some research on her during lunch. Richard, she's not just some law professor. She clerked for Thurgood Marshall. She's argued before circuit courts. She's published in every major law review." Dalton waved dismissively. "Academic credentials don't translate to courtroom victories. She's still just a law school teacher playing lawyer. This afternoon, when I cross-examine their witnesses, I'm going to expose how out of her depth she really is." "But what if—" "Jason, I've been doing this for 25 years. I know how to handle idealistic professors who think they can take on corporate America. Trust me, that confidence, that certainty that he was superior, it was about to cost him everything." Court reconvened at 2 p.m. Elaine called her first witness, Mrs. Chen herself. Mrs. Chen walked slowly to the witness stand, her English accented but clear, her dignity unmistakable despite her modest clothing. Elaine approached gently. "Mrs. Chen, how long did you work at Millbrook Manufacturing?" 42 years, Mrs. Chen replied. "I start when I come to America." "I was 28 years old." "And during those 42 years, did you pay into the pension plan?" "Every paycheck. They take money from my pay. They say when I retire, I have money to live. I trust them." "What happened when the company closed?" Mrs. Chen's voice wavered. "They say company bankrupt. No money for pension. I lose everything I save. Now I'm 73 years old. I clean houses to pay rent." Several jurors looked visibly moved. One woman was blinking back tears. Dalton stood for cross-examination with barely concealed disdain. "Mrs. Chen, you received a salary for 42 years, correct?" "Yes." "And you were paid for every hour you worked?" "Yes, but just yes or no, please. You received compensation for your labor, didn't you?" "Yes, but they promise—" "Thank you, that's all." Dalton turned to the judge. Your Honor, I'd like to note for the record that this witness received full compensation for all services rendered. The pension was a benefit, not a guaranteed payment. He'd just made a fatal error, and Elaine was about to show him why. Objection, Your Honor, Elaine said calmly. Mr. Dalton is testifying rather than questioning, and he's mischaracterizing employment law. The pension contributions were part of Mrs. Chen's compensation package. They were deferred wages, not a benefit the company could simply choose not to pay. Judge Morrison nodded. Sustained. Mr. Dalton, stick to questions. But Dalton wasn't done being condescending. Ms. Crawford, perhaps you're not familiar with corporate employment law, but Mr. Dalton, Judge Morrison interrupted sharply, address the court, not opposing counsel, and I assure you, Ms. Crawford's familiarity with employment law is not in question. Dalton's face reddened again, but he pressed on. Over the next hour, he called expert witnesses who testified about bankruptcy procedures, corporate restructuring, and fiduciary obligations. It was designed to confuse, to make the case seem so complex that the jury would simply side with the corporate defendants. But when Elaine cross-examined, she did something remarkable. She translated every piece of technical jargon into simple English. Dr. Hamilton, she asked one expert, you testified that Millbrook engaged in strategic asset repositioning. Can you tell the jury what that means in plain English? The expert hesitated. Well, they moved assets to protect them from creditors. They hid money so they wouldn't have to pay their debts. Is that accurate? That's an oversimplification, but is it accurate? In essence, yes. And with each answer, Elaine was building a case that even the most complex corporate defense couldn't overcome. As the afternoon wore on, Dalton's frustration grew. His technical strategy wasn't working. The jury wasn't impressed by jargon. They were responding to Elaine's clear, straightforward presentation of the facts. Finally, at 4:30 p.m., Judge Morrison called a recess. We'll continue tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Court is adjourned. As the courtroom emptied, Elaine gathered her papers. Marcus leaned over and whispered urgently, Professor, my phone's been blowing up. Something's happening in D.C. The news. Elaine nodded. She knew. The announcement had gone out at 2 p.m. 3 hours ago. By now, every news outlet in the country knew her name. She walked out of the courtroom into the courthouse hallway, and suddenly she understood what had happened. A wall of cameras, reporters shouting questions, security guards trying to maintain order. Dr. Crawford. How does it feel to be nominated to the Supreme Court? Dr. Crawford. Did opposing counsel know who you were? Dr. Crawford. What do you have to say about Richard Dalton's comments? Because someone had leaked courtroom audio. Dalton's condescending remarks about her qualifications, his dismissive tone, his assumption that she was just some law professor playing lawyer. And now it was national news. Elaine held up a hand and the crowd quieted. When she spoke, her voice was steady, professional, and absolutely in control. I'm honored by the president's nomination. But right now, my focus is on my clients, Mrs. Chen and 217 other workers who deserve justice. When this case is concluded, I'll be happy to discuss the nomination. Until then, I have work to do. She walked through the crowd with Marcus at her side, got into a waiting car and drove away. Behind her, still in the courthouse, Richard Dalton was having the worst moment of his professional life. His phone was ringing nonstop, his firm's senior partners, clients, the media, everyone wanting to know why he'd publicly questioned the qualifications of a Supreme Court nominee. His assistant showed him a trending Twitter hashtag Dalton underestimated. Video clips of his condescending remarks were being shared millions of times. Legal commentators were eviscerating him. His own firm was already discussing damage control. He'd thought he was arguing against some nobody. He'd been arguing against one of the most accomplished legal minds in America. And he'd done it with arrogance and condescension that was now preserved forever on the internet. That evening, Elaine sat in her modest apartment in Brooklyn, reviewing case files. Her phone had been ringing constantly, but she'd turned it off. Tomorrow, she had to be back in court. Mrs. Chen deserved her full attention. A knock at her door. She opened it to find Senator Walsh standing there with 2 Secret Service agents. Dr. Crawford, he said with a slight smile. "I thought you might like to know. Richard Dalton's law firm just issued a formal apology. Several major clients have dropped them, and the American Bar Association is reviewing his conduct for potential ethics violations." Elaine nodded slowly. "I didn't want to ruin his career, Senator. I just wanted to win my case." "You did both," Walsh replied. "And you did it with grace and dignity. That's exactly why you're going to be on the Supreme Court." But the case wasn't over. Tomorrow, Elaine would have to walk back into that courtroom, face Dalton again, and prove that justice wasn't just about grand nominations and media attention. It was about keeping promises to people like Mrs. Chen. And Richard Dalton was about to learn what happens when you underestimate someone based on assumptions rather than facts. The next morning, the scene outside Manhattan Civil Court was unlike anything the building had seen in decades. News vans lined the street. Reporters with cameras jostled for position. Security had been tripled. Everyone wanted to see what would happen when Supreme Court nominee Dr. Elaine Crawford walked back into that courtroom to face the man who'd publicly dismissed her credentials. But Elaine wasn't thinking about the cameras or the national attention. She was thinking about Mrs. Chen, who'd texted her at 6 a.m. "Thank you for not giving up on us." Elaine arrived early, walking through the media gauntlet with her head high and her expression calm. Marcus was already inside, setting up their presentation materials. "Professor," he said nervously, "Dalton's here." "He looks different." Different was an understatement. When Richard Dalton entered the courtroom, he looked like a man who'd aged 10 years overnight. His usual confident swagger was gone, replaced by a careful, measured walk. His expensive suit seemed to hang differently on him, as if the weight of his mistake was physical. You could feel the shift in power. Yesterday, he'd looked at Elaine with condescension. Today, he couldn't meet her eyes. The gallery was packed beyond capacity. Legal observers, journalists, law students, and members of the public who'd been moved by Mrs. Chen's story. Judge Morrison had to call for order twice before the room settled. "We're here to continue the case of Chen versus Millbrook Manufacturing," she announced firmly. "And let me be very clear, this is a courtroom, not a media circus. The case will be decided on the merits of the legal arguments, not on external factors. Is that understood?" Both Elaine and Dalton nodded. "Good." "Ms. Crawford, you may call your next witness." Elaine stood. "Your Honor, the plaintiffs call Marcus Reed to present financial documentation to the jury." Marcus took the stand, and with calm professionalism, he walked the jury through the evidence they'd discovered. Bank records, wire transfers, Shell Corporation filings. Each document told part of the story of how Millbrook executives had systematically looted the pension fund. "This transfer here," Marcus explained, pointing to a highlighted entry on a projected spreadsheet, shows $2.3 million moved to Sunset Holdings LLC 3 days before the bankruptcy filing. The registered address for Sunset Holdings is the personal residence of Millbrook's CFO. A juror gasped audibly. Another shook her head in disgust. Dalton stood for cross-examination, and for the first time in his career, he seemed uncertain. "Mr. Reed, these transactions, were they illegal under bankruptcy law?" It was a weak question, and everyone knew it. "They were fraudulent transfers designed to hide assets from creditors," Marcus replied confidently, "which is both illegal and grounds for piercing the corporate veil." Dalton sat down without further questions. He looked defeated. But Elaine wasn't finished. She had one more witness who would seal the case completely. "Your Honor," Elaine said, "the plaintiffs call Thomas Brennan, former chief financial officer of Millbrook Manufacturing." A murmur went through the courtroom. Brennan was the defense's key witness, scheduled to testify later in the week, but Elaine had subpoenaed him for the plaintiff's case. Brennan took the stand reluctantly, sworn in, and faced Elaine with obvious discomfort. "Mr. Brennan," Elaine began, her voice gentle but firm, "you were responsible for managing Millbrook's pension fund, correct?" "Among other financial responsibilities, yes. And you were aware that the fund was fully funded, that there was sufficient money to pay all promised pensions?" Brennan hesitated. "The fund was complex." "Mr. Brennan, please answer the question. Was the pension fund fully funded before you began transferring assets to offshore accounts?" Dalton shot to his feet. Objection. Assumes facts not in evidence. Your Honor, Elaine said calmly, I'm about to put those facts in evidence. She handed a document to the bailiff. This is a forensic audit conducted by the plaintiffs showing the pension fund status before and after Mr. Brennan's asset transfers. Judge Morrison reviewed the document. Overruled. The witness will answer. Brennan's shoulders slumped. Yes, the fund was fully funded. So when you told Mrs. Chen and 200 other workers that there was no money for their pensions, that was a lie. It was more complicated than, was it a lie, Mr. Brennan? A long pause, then quietly, yes. The courtroom erupted. Judge Morrison's gavel came down repeatedly. But the damage to the defense was irreversible. Elaine continued her questioning, and over the next hour she methodically destroyed every argument the defense had made. The bankruptcy wasn't necessary. It was manufactured. The assets weren't protected. They were stolen. The executives didn't act in good faith. They committed fraud. When she finished, even Dalton knew there was no point in redirect. The case was over. Judge Morrison called both attorneys to the bench for a sidebar. Mr. Dalton, she said quietly, I strongly suggest you speak with your clients about a settlement. This jury is going to award significant damages, and after what we've heard today, they might add punitive damages that could bankrupt your clients personally. Dalton nodded miserably. I understand, Your Honor. Ms. Crawford, Judge Morrison continued, your clients are entitled to their day in court, but a settlement might be faster and more certain. Would they be amenable? Elaine glanced back at Mrs. Chen, who was wiping tears from her eyes. Let me speak with them, Your Honor. During the lunch recess, Dalton approached Elaine for the first time since the nomination announcement. He looked like a man approaching the gallows. Dr. Crawford, he said quietly, I need to apologize. What I said yesterday about your qualifications, it was inappropriate and disrespectful. I made assumptions based on prejudices I didn't even know I had. This was the moment when someone who'd spent his whole career believing he was superior finally understood he was wrong. Elaine studied him for a moment. She could have destroyed him further, could have given a speech about bias and assumptions, could have humiliated him the way he'd tried to humiliate her. Instead, she said simply, Mr. Dalton, I accept your apology. Now, do you have a settlement offer for my clients? The settlement was reached that afternoon. Millbrook's executives would return every dollar of the pension fund, plus interest, plus an additional $5 million in punitive damages to be distributed among the workers. They would also face criminal charges for fraud. Mrs. Chen cried when Elaine told her, You did this. You fought for us. We did this together, Elaine replied. You were brave enough to stand up to a corporation. That takes courage. As they left the courthouse, the media was waiting. This time, Elaine stopped to speak. Today, justice was served for Mrs. Chen and 217 other workers who were promised something and had it stolen. This case was never about me. It was about keeping promises to people who work hard and play by the rules. A reporter called out, Dr. Crawford, how did it feel to argue this case while knowing you were about to be nominated to the Supreme Court? Elaine smiled slightly. It felt like being a lawyer, which is what I've been for 30 years and what I hope to continue being, in one form or another, for many more years to come. But there was one more conversation that needed to happen, one more lesson that needed to be taught. That evening, Elaine agreed to meet Richard Dalton at a quiet coffee shop in Brooklyn, far from the media circus. He arrived looking exhausted. Thank you for agreeing to see me. You said you wanted to talk. I'm listening. Dalton sat down heavily. My firm is considering letting me go. 3 major clients have dropped us. The Bar Association is investigating. My reputation is destroyed. I didn't do that to you, Richard. You did that to yourself. I know. He looked directly at her for the first time. Can I ask you something? When I made those comments yesterday morning, why didn't you tell me who you were? Elaine considered the question. Because I shouldn't have needed to. Every lawyer who walks into a courtroom deserves to be judged by the quality of their arguments, not by assumptions about their background. You saw a black woman in a modest suit and assumed she was inferior. That's the problem. You're right, Dalton said quietly. I've spent 25 years in corporate law, surrounded by people who look like me, think like me, come from the same background. I convinced myself that was excellence, when really it was just comfortable familiarity. So what are you going to do about it? I don't know. Learn, change, try to be better. He paused. If I even still have a career. Elaine leaned forward. Richard, you're a talented lawyer. You prepared thoroughly, you knew the law, you fought hard for your client. Your problem wasn't lack of skill, it was lack of respect. If you can fix that, if you can learn to see people for who they are rather than what you assume, you'll be fine. It was a generous gesture to someone who'd tried to humiliate her. But that was who Elaine was, and that's exactly why she was about to join the Supreme Court. 3 months later, Dr. Elaine Crawford was confirmed to the Supreme Court by a vote of 68 to 32. Her confirmation hearings had been remarkably smooth. When senators questioned her judicial philosophy, she referenced the Chen case. Justice isn't about complexity or sophisticated legal arguments, she told the Judiciary Committee. It's about keeping promises. It's about treating every person who walks into a courtroom with dignity. And it's about remembering that the law exists to protect the vulnerable, not just the powerful. The quote went viral. Legal scholars called it a defining moment, and Mrs. Chen, watching from the gallery during the confirmation, cried tears of joy. On the day of her swearing-in ceremony, Elaine invited Mrs. Chen to attend. As she took the oath of office, her hand on the Bible, she thought about the journey that had brought her here. From a childhood in rural Georgia to Harvard Law, to clerking for Justice Marshall, to teaching at Columbia, to that courtroom in Manhattan where Richard Dalton had underestimated her. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that excellence comes in all forms, and that assumptions based on appearance are always wrong, then you understand why representation matters, why diversity matters, why we should never judge people by what we expect them to be. After the ceremony, a reporter asked Elaine what she wanted people to remember about her journey to the court. She smiled and said, "Remember that every person you meet might be more than you assume. Every lawyer you underestimate might be extraordinary. Every worker you dismiss might be the key to your biggest case. Judge people by their character and their actions, not by your prejudices." And somewhere in New York, Richard Dalton was rebuilding his career, taking on more pro bono cases, mentoring lawyers from diverse backgrounds, and teaching young associates a lesson he'd learned the hard way. Never underestimate anyone. The truth always wins. Excellence always rises, and those who judge others based on appearance rather than substance always pay the price. Have you ever been underestimated because of how you looked or where you came from? You're not alone. And stories like Dr. Crawford's prove that no matter how others see you, your truth will speak louder than their assumptions. Drop a comment below and share your story. Let's celebrate the moments when we prove the doubters wrong. Thanks for watching. And remember, respect everyone, because you never know who you're really talking to.